Right at this moment, while you are reading these lines, something is happening that almost no one on Earth knows about. At a distance of nearly 3 billion kilometers from us, there is a blue-green planet rolling along on its orbit around the Sun, just as it has rolled for 4 billion years. No spacecraft has ever returned there since the mid-1980s, no telescope has ever photographed it up close, and no scientific model we have built of it in the past 4 decades is truly accurate. This is not a new discovery about a distant planet. This is not data from a mission that has just arrived. It is based on data tapes collected before the internet existed, before home computers existed, before most of the scientists studying them now were even born. 6 hours. That is all we have. To put it in perspective, a single workday of yours in the office is longer than the total time humanity has spent looking closely at this planet. And for the 38 years after that, every textbook, every scientific model, every mental picture anyone has ever formed of Uranus was drawn from those 6 hours. The researchers who have just reopened those old tapes are not using words like interesting or surprising. They are using words like astonished, baffling, and we were wrong. This is the story of Uranus, and this is the part the headlines are not telling you. It is not only that what the scientists have just found is worth stopping for, it is what that finding is telling you about everything else you are currently believing based on a single moment. That is what is happening with the data right now that no one is talking about, and that is what will happen in the next few years. A window has been locked tight on the calendar that if we miss the next generation, we'll continue living in the misunderstanding we have only just discovered. Because even after the new discovery recalibrates everything, there is still one single detail in the old data that does not fit. A detail that if you pull that thread, the entire new structure of understanding Uranus begins to tremble. Stay with me, because by the time this story ends, you will never look at the story the same way again. Subscribe right now if you want to hear more about this universe, because we are only just beginning. Let us go back to the beginning. One spring night, in a small garden in the city of Bath in England, a musician named William Herschel pointed his homemade telescope at the night sky. The original purpose was simple and modest. He was only mapping the faint stars, recording the bright dots he saw doing the work he loved in his free time between musical performances. The expected expectation was nothing special. Just an ordinary night of observation by an amateur musician passionate about the sky. What actually happened was one of the most unexpected things in the history of science, and most people do not know how unexpected it was. Herschel did not discover a star. He saw a faint bright dot moving through the lens in a way no star could move. He had stumbled upon a new planet, a blue-green world, that had existed there for 4 billion years without anyone ever knowing of its existence. That planet is still there, still slowly rotating on its strangely tilted axis like a giant bowling ball kicked off course from somewhere in the distant past, still silent, still waiting for someone finally to visit it more closely. Then something happened that suddenly made the entire story much more difficult. No one could get there. Here's a way to picture it. The planets are constantly moving around the Sun at their own speeds and periods. Jupiter takes 12 years to complete one orbit. Uranus takes 84 years. Neptune takes 165 years. Because those periods are different, the vast majority of the time, the 4 gas giant planets are scattered in positions that cannot be reached by a single spacecraft. But occasionally, very occasionally, all 4 planets line up on one side of the Sun in a perfect geometry that allows a single craft to fly past all of them in one trip. That alignment occurs only once every 175 years. The next window will open around the year 2153. No one listening to this story will live to see that day. The last physical window our civilization could actually use in this lifetime opened at the end of the 1970s, and then it closed. Think about what that means. On the 24th of January in the year 1986, at 7:28 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time, a spacecraft named Voyager 2 crossed an invisible boundary it did not even realize was a boundary. That was the bow shock of Uranus, the point where the solar wind suddenly slows when it hits the magnetic field of the 7th planet in the solar system. In the control room at JPL in California, a scientist named Norman Ness held in his hands the first printouts as data from Uranus' magnetic field began to flow back through the deep space network. That was the moment humanity first in history saw a portrait of Uranus. And for the 38 years after that, this portrait became everything we knew. The first close-up photo was taken at a distance of 5.7 million miles from the planet, revealing a smooth blue-green sphere without the dramatic cloud bands of Jupiter or Saturn, just a uniform blue color. Because methane in the atmosphere absorbs red light and reflects blue light back into space. Voyager 2 also discovered 11 new moons around Uranus, small worlds never seen before, along with the 5 large known moons, Miranda Ariel, Umbriel, Titania, and Oberon. But what truly stunned the scientific community was not the moons or the blue of the atmosphere, it was the magnetic field. Uranus' magnetic field is tilted 59 degrees relative to the planet rotational axis. Imagine Earth where the magnetic North Pole is not near the geographic North Pole at the Arctic, but sits in the middle of the Sahara Desert. That is Uranus, and that is only the beginning. The source of the magnetic field is not at the center of the planet, but offset from the center by about 1/3 of the radius, like the magnetic axis, does not pass through the center of Earth, but through a point somewhere under the crust of the Pacific Ocean. For 38 years, we believed that was the nature of Uranus. Inside that magnetosphere, Voyager 2 detected extremely strong electron radiation belts, second only to the radiation belts of Jupiter in the entire solar system. But what was stranger still was that the magnetosphere itself was almost completely empty of plasma. In planetary science, this is called a vacuum magnetosphere. This is something that should not exist. The moons of Uranus should have been spewing ions into that magnetosphere just as the moons of Jupiter and Saturn still do. But the Voyager 2 data showed that Miranda, Ariel, Umbriel, Titania, and Oberon seemed to contribute nothing at all. They seemed to be dead, geologically dead, inactive. The conclusion in the planetary science community settled into a single description for 3 decades. Uranus is the oddball, the outlier. Evidence that the universe has places where our ordinary rules do not apply. For the 38 years after that, this description became packaged truth. Uranus is weird. Close the chapter, move on to the next. On the 11th of November in the year 2024, the journal Nature Astronomy published a paper with a very straightforward title, The Anomalous State of the Uranus Magnetosphere, during the Voyager 2 flyby. The lead author was Jamie Jasinski, a plasma physicist at JPL. Jasinski team included scientists from NASA-owned JPL, the University of Michigan, University College London in England, and the Max Planck Institute for Solar System Research in Germany. 4 of the world-leading planetary science institutions, all listed on a single paper. And what they did was so simple, it forces you to stop and think. They reopened the solar wind data that Voyager 2 itself had measured in the 2 weeks before the spacecraft encountered Uranus, plus 8 months of data around the encounter. That is all they did. Not launch a new mission, not wait for data from a new generation telescope, simply reopen the data files that had existed for 38 years, and look at them in a way no one had ever looked. What they found changed everything. In the few days right before Voyager 2 crossed the bow, the dynamic pressure of the solar wind had increased by a factor of 20 times. This was an extreme solar wind event, a phenomenon called a co-rotating interaction region, or CIR for short. This is what happens when high-speed solar wind plows into slower wind ahead, creating a giant electromagnetic shock that propagates outward through the solar system. That shock had reached Uranus a few days before Voyager 2. It had compressed the Uranus magnetosphere down to about 20% of its normal size. It had pushed the plasma out of the magnetosphere. It had pumped electrons into the radiation belts. It had created exactly the description we had believed was normal for 38 years. When Jasinski and his team examined the 8 months of solar wind data around Uranus orbit, they calculated that the solar wind conditions at the time Voyager 2 flew by occurred only about 4% of the time. 4%. That was not a portrait of Uranus. That was a snapshot of a person while they were crying. And we framed it and called it their true face. Now pay attention to this, because this is the detail very few people are talking about. Jasinski's new interpretation solves 2 of the 3 major mysteries about Uranus that we just listed. The CIR explains the vacuum magnetosphere because the extreme solar wind pushed the plasma out. The CIR explains the extremely strong electron radiation belts because the shock pumped electrons into those belts. But the 3rd mystery, the magnetic field tilted 59 degrees, and the magnetic field source offset from the center of the planet by 1/3 of the radius, the CIR does not explain. We will come back to that. If Voyager 2 had arrived only a few days earlier, Uranus would have looked like a normal gas giant planet. Not odd, not bizarre, but it did not arrive earlier. It arrived exactly at the moment the entire region was being distorted by a cosmic storm. And for 38 years we believed what it saw in those 6 hours, as if that was the portrait of Uranus. This is the part that makes this story no longer abstract. Because if we can misunderstand a planet for 38 years simply because we arrived at the wrong time, then the natural next question is, how many other things are we currently misunderstanding? Earth atmospheric models are built from specific measurement windows in the past. Earth magnetic field models are built from specific moments in the past. Climate models are built from specific data samples in the past. Every one of those models carries within it an implicit assumption. The assumption that the moment we measured is representative of the normal behavior of the system. But Uranus has just reminded us that that assumption can be wrong, and can be wrong for decades without anyone noticing. Voyager 2 arrived at Uranus at a 4% moment. How many data points in the history of Earth science also belong to a 4% moment that we have never questioned? How many things we are teaching in physics, astronomy, biology, and climate textbooks are built from brief windows that we took to be normal? This is not a paranoid question. This is the question every serious scientist after the 2024 paper is having to face. And this is the question that you, the person listening to this story, should also face. Because the way we understand the universe and our place in it depends on the assumption that what we measure is representative. Uranus has just shown us that assumption is not always true, but the question does not stop at science. Because the same logic that caused Uranus to be misunderstood for 38 years is also operating everywhere else in the way we understand the world. In the way we understand other people, in the way we understand ourselves. Someone looked at you once, in a moment when you were not representative of yourself, and packaged that moment into the truth about you. You looked at someone once in a moment when they were not representative of themselves, and packaged that moment into the truth about them. We will come back to that at the end of the story. But first, let me tell you about a man who spent his entire life on a misunderstanding he never got to know was a misunderstanding. The Voyager 2 data from January of the year 1986 never disappeared. It was carefully archived, first on magnetic tapes, then converted to digital format, then uploaded to NASA Planetary Data System, where any scientist on the planet with an internet connection can download it for free. For 38 years, that data sat there, waiting, not locked, not lost. It simply was not looked at in the right way. The truth about the CIR compressing the Uranus magnetosphere sat waiting in those files. No new technology needed, no supercomputer needed, just someone thinking to ask the question. And no one thought of it for 38 years. In that time, scientists lived entire careers believing the old interpretation. They wrote papers, books, university lectures based on the description of Uranus as the planet with the strangest magnetic field in the solar system. They taught students that Uranus was the oddball, and among them there was one person in particular who needs to be mentioned. His name was Ed Stone. Ed Stone was the Voyager project scientist. He held that role for more than 50 years from the year 1972 until he retired in the year 2022. This is the longest tenure in the entire history of NASA for a scientist leading a single mission. He was there when the 2 Voyager spacecraft were designed. He was there when they flew past Uranus. He was there when they crossed the heliopause. Throughout those more than 50 years, he told the story of Uranus in hundreds of lectures. He dedicated his entire career to a misunderstanding. On the 11th of June, in the year 2024, Ed Stone passed away at the age of 88. 5 months after the day he died, Jamie Jasinski paper appeared in Nature Astronomy. Ed Stone never got to know. He left still believing the old interpretation. The truth had been there throughout his working life. It lay in the very data his team had collected. But it was not seen in time for him to know. Ed Stone was not the only one. An entire generation of Voyager scientists passed through their careers with a misunderstanding they had no way to correct themselves. Not because they lacked ability, but because none of them thought to go back and ask the simple question that Jasinski asked 4 decades later. That is the quietest lesson in this entire story. But the story does not stop there, because once you recalibrate according to the 2024 discovery, once you assume that the normal Uranus magnetosphere is much larger than what Voyager 2 measured, contains far more plasma, and has much gentler radiation belts, then the moons of Uranus suddenly become very interesting again. And among them, the moon that has forced the scientific community to go back and look most carefully is Miranda. Miranda is the innermost of the 5 large moons of Uranus, a small world only about 470 kilometers in diameter, almost a ball of ice rolling around its parent planet. But on the surface of Miranda, there are things that no other moon in the solar system has. Giant canyons, up to 19 kilometers deep, 4 times deeper than Earth Grand Canyon. The surrounding terrain looks as if someone repeatedly pressed the pieces of the moon together and then broke them apart again, leaving a chaotic surface of uneven-sized patches joined by deep cracks. For 38 years, we called those canyons the scars of an ancient impact. An accident that happened in the distant past, long extinguished, long finished. Miranda was put into textbooks as a corpse, a relic. But if the compressed magnetosphere was an illusion, if the moons were judged through a 4% moment just like their parent planet, then those canyons may not be scars of death either. They may still be expanding right now. Miranda may still be geologically alive. We do not know. Ariel also has surface features that suggest relatively recent geological activity along grooves and valleys that appear to have been resurfaced after formation. Titania, the largest moon of Uranus, has been suggested by recent simulations to possibly contain a liquid water ocean beneath its icy crust. If any of these moons are truly spewing material into the magnetosphere, and we missed it because Voyager 2 arrived exactly when the solar winds swept away all the evidence, then we have overlooked a series of potential candidates for extraterrestrial biology for 38 years. Not Europa, not Enceladus, but the moons of Uranus, and something even stranger. When the CIR compressed the Uranus magnetosphere, the magnetic field lines of Uranus interacted strongly with the magnetic field lines carried in the solar wind. They cut each other, reconnect, release energy, and pump charged particles inward. This is the same mechanism that creates geomagnetic storms on Earth. Uranus may have geomagnetic storms. Uranus may have auroras like Earth, only many times stronger. For 38 years, we did not know. And this is the point where I have to stop and tell you something. Because everything you just heard, every part of this new interpretation, rests on the assumption that the extreme solar wind explained everything Voyager 2 saw. But it did not explain everything. There is a detail in the original data that even the solar wind cannot explain. A detail that Jasinski paper acknowledged but could not resolve. We will come back to that. But first, let us talk about what is happening right now in the real world regarding Uranus. In the year 2023, the United States National Academy of Sciences published the Decadal Survey on Planetary Science for the period 2023 to 2032. This is the document that decides which missions NASA will prioritize in the coming decade, a document written by hundreds of leading scientists in the field, a document that shapes an entire generation of space exploration. In the number one position ahead of Mars, ahead of comets, ahead of asteroids, ahead of Enceladus, ahead of everything else, the Decadal Survey placed a mission called Uranus Orbiter and Probe, an orbiter that would circle Uranus for years, an atmospheric probe that would drop into the planet, the top priority of American planetary science for this decade. 3 years after that priority was announced, as of the present moment, the mission still has not been fully funded. No launch date has been scheduled, no prime contractor has been selected, no final design has been approved. The reason is very simple and very painful. NASA is being stretched between too many priorities with insufficient budget. Mars sample return is overrunning costs and threatens to swallow other projects. Artemis is spending money at a rate unprecedented in the agency history. The James Webb Space Telescope, even after a successful launch, still needs money to operate each year. And while all of that is happening, the number one priority of the Decadal Survey remains on paper. But here is the detail almost no one is talking about. Voyager 2 itself, the machine that accidentally deceived us for 38 years about the nature of Uranus, is also dying. Voyager 2 draws power from 3 devices called radioisotope thermoelectric generators. These are essentially containers of plutonium-238 that produce heat as the plutonium slowly decays, and that heat is converted into electricity. When the spacecraft was launched, the 3 devices produced about 470 watts of power. Today, nearly 50 years later, they produce only about 250 watts. They lose about 4 watts each year. At some point in the early 2030s, the output will drop below the minimum needed to run any remaining instruments, and Voyager 2 will fall silent forever. And this is the most heartbreaking irony in the entire story. The only machine that ever saw Uranus up close is dying at the same time we discover that what it saw was not representative, and while it falls silent, no other spacecraft is flying to Uranus to replace it. No contractor is building one. No design is waiting to be launched. If we want an orbiter around Uranus in this lifetime, we must act very quickly. Because to reach Uranus in a reasonable time, a spacecraft needs something we cannot create, only wait for, a gravitational assist from Jupiter. And that window does not open every year. The window is closing. The optimal window to launch a spacecraft to Uranus opens around the year 2031 to 2032. This is not the same kind of window we talked about at the beginning of the story. The 175-year window is the window for a grand tour that flies past all 4 gas giants in a single launch. The window we are talking about now is a different window, a much smaller window, a window only for a dedicated trip to Uranus. It depends on the position of Jupiter. Because to reach Uranus in a reasonable time, a spacecraft needs Jupiter to bend its path with its gravity, a technique called a gravity assist. Jupiter takes 11.86 years to orbit the Sun once. That means the window for an optimal gravity assist from Jupiter to Uranus opens only a few times in our lives, and the next window is 2031 to 2032. If NASA launches in that window, the spacecraft will arrive at Uranus around the year 2044 to 2049, depending on the design. If that window is missed, the next acceptable window is around the year 2044. And by then, the flight time will be much longer, arriving at Uranus possibly as late as the year 2060. This is something very few people are talking about. By the year 2044, the scientists who directly saw Uranus through Voyager 2 will almost all be gone. Bradford Smith, who led the Voyager imaging team, passed away in the year 2018. Ellis Minor, deputy project manager of Voyager for decades, is elderly. Norman Ness, if he is still alive in the year 2044, will be over 90 years old. Ed Stone left before he knew. Uranus will be rediscovered by a generation of scientists not yet born when Voyager 2 flew by 4 decades earlier. The questions the original team asked about the tilted magnetic field, about the moons, about the radiation belts, will be answered for a different generation. This is not a personal tragedy. This is a structural tragedy of science. A space mission whose completion cycle is longer than the lifespan of the humans who create it. The ones who begin never get to see the end, the 2032 window. It is not merely a technical opportunity. It is a moral opportunity, the only opportunity in the lifetime of most of the audience listening to this story for humanity to truly see Uranus as it is. And if we miss it, the next generation will continue living in the misunderstanding we have only just discovered. This is what makes the entire story uncomfortable in a way no scientific paper can express. The Voyager 2 data from January of the year 1986 has been and continues to be archived at NASA Planetary Data System for nearly 4 decades. Anyone with an internet connection can access it. University students can download it, independent researchers can analyze it. Every tape, every record, every measured value is sitting there open to the public, waiting in digital filing cabinets. And for 38 years, the truth about the CIR compressing the Uranus magnetosphere sat waiting in those files. How many other truths are sitting in the hard drives of space agencies right now, waiting to be read again? Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 collected data at Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, most of which has never been reanalyzed with modern eyes. Cassini collected 13 years of data at Saturn, only a small fraction of which has been fully analyzed. Galileo collected data at Jupiter for 8 years and still has unprocessed data sets. Pioneer 10 and 11 still have data that has never been re-examined. Magellan at Venus, Viking at Mars, Mariner at Mercury. Every database is a possibility for a Uranus-style discovery, a truth waiting for someone to look at it the right way. We do not lack data, we lack attention. And as the scientists who collected that data pass away one by one because they age and because time does not stand still, the chance to ask them, "Did you remember anything unusual?" also goes with them. Ed Stone cannot tell us whether he remembered anything unusual about Uranus in the week before the encounter. He is gone. That question has no one left to answer it. How many other Ed Stones are aging right now with memories of things no one ever asked them about at the right time? What makes this story even heavier is that Voyager 2 itself, the machine that accidentally deceived us for 38 years, is also the machine carrying humanity's eternal message into interstellar space. Bolted to the frame of the spacecraft is the Golden Record, a gold-plated copper disc, containing greetings in 55 languages, 90 minutes of music from cultures across human history, the sound of rain falling in a forest, the sound of human laughter, and a map of Earth location drawn from the positions of pulsars, so that anyone who finds it will know exactly where we are in the galaxy. In 40,000 years, Voyager 2 will fly past a star named Ross 248 in the constellation Andromeda at a distance of 1.7 light-years. That is the next random stop on its journey. By then, every question we are asking today will have long been answered or completely forgotten. The machine will still be flying, patient, anonymous, carrying the map of a planet whose name no one remembers anymore. And now we must return to the one detail that does not fit. Because everything up to this point, the CIR compressing the magnetosphere, the possibly living moons, the 2032 window, all of that rests on the assumption that the extreme solar wind explained everything Voyager 2 saw. But it did not explain everything. There is a detail in the 1986 data that remains completely unexplainable by the solar wind. That detail is the magnetic field of Uranus itself. The magnetic field tilted 59 degrees relative to the rotational axis. The source of the magnetic field offset from the center of the planet by 1/3 of the radius. The solar wind can compress the magnetosphere, the solar wind can push plasma outward, the solar wind can pump electrons into the radiation belts, but the solar wind cannot tilt the magnetic axis of a planet. The solar wind cannot shift the magnetic center away from the planetary center. Those properties are intrinsic to Uranus. They come from inside the planet. We are still left with a question larger than the original one. Inside Earth, the convection currents of liquid iron in the outer core generate a relatively symmetric magnetic field aligned with the rotational axis. Inside Jupiter, metallic hydrogen under enormous pressure generates a strong magnetic field that is also fairly well aligned. Inside Uranus, something is completely different. Models suggest that the core of Uranus may contain a layer of superionic water ice, a strange state of matter in which the oxygen nuclei form a rigid crystal lattice while the protons flow freely through it like a liquid. Such a layer could generate a magnetic field by a mechanism entirely different from standard planetary dynamos. Or, and this is the possibility that keeps theorists awake at night, the magnetic field of Uranus may not be generated in the core at all. It may be generated in a thin layer near the surface. If that is true, everything we think we know about how gas giant planets generate their magnetic fields needs to be rewritten from the beginning. No model resolves it. No data distinguishes between the two hypotheses. The only way to answer is to send a spacecraft into orbit around Uranus and measure the magnetic field for years at many latitudes. We do not have that spacecraft. We could have it if the 2032 window is used. If not, this question remains open until the middle of the next century. This is what I want you to carry with you when this story ends. 6 hours on the 24th of January in the year 1986. 38 years of misunderstanding. 4% probability. One detail that still does not fit. Uranus is still there. It orbits the Sun once every 84 years. It was there when Herschel discovered it in the year 1781. It was there throughout the 38 years we misunderstood it. It will be there when the next orbiter arrives if we launch. It will be there if we do not launch. It does not care at all whether we understand it correctly or incorrectly. That is something a planet can do, and a human cannot. Humans carry their misunderstandings about themselves to the grave. Ed Stone left before he knew he had been wrong. An entire generation of Voyager science is closing their final chapter with a misunderstanding they never got to correct. But Uranus is still there, patient, uncaring, waiting for someone finally to look at it the right way. If we can misunderstand a planet for 38 years simply because we arrived at the wrong time, then in your own life, how many times have you been misunderstood by people who happen to see you only in your 4% moment? How many people in your life have you judged through a moment that did not represent them? How many truths about the universe, about the people you love, about yourself, are still waiting to be looked at again with more patient eyes? The question is not whether we are paying attention to Uranus. The question is how many other things we are still misunderstanding without knowing. 6 hours, 38 years, 4%, one detail that still does not fit, and a window that is closing. If this kind of story is what you are looking for here, then subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because next time we will go into the hard drives of Magellan at Venus, 4 years of radar data about a planet we judged through models from the 1990s and then turned our backs on. And what is waiting there will make you wonder why we abandoned that planet for so long. Leave a comment with the thing that made you think the most in this video. And share it with a friend who needs to hear this story, because there are truths that deserve to be looked at again with new eyes, and Uranus has just given us a reason to do that with everything else in our lives.